I'm very happy to be here. I've given the talk many times, but today is a special occasion for me because many of our team members are there in the audience. Okay. And they're the ones who are developing the Thunder protocol. And if you are interested in our projects, you should talk to our incredibly strong team members, maybe in the after party. Okay, so I'm here to talk about Thunder token, a fast and high throughput cryptocurrency. You can think of it as a very fast version of Ethereum because we are going to support EVM smart contracts. So 2017 is often said to be the year of the ICO, and 2018 is the year of the dApps. There are many exciting dApps. For example, there are games on blockchains like CryptoKitty. There's sharing economy, like putting Uber and Airbnb on blockchains. There are many others, like prediction markets, social networks, and so on and so forth. Okay, so now, with all this excitement, there is a truth that everyone kind of knows, but no one particularly enjoys admitting, is the fact that today's blockchains are simply too slow to support the needs of all these dApps. In fact, none of these dApps can take off at scale with today's blockchain infrastructure. And let me give you an example. This chart shows Ethereum transaction fees over time. Okay, in December last year, this was a particularly exciting time for our community, partly because CryptoKitty came around back in December. And as we all know, this is like a collectible game on top of Ethereum. In comparison with classical games like social network games or mobile games, it's not like they have a huge amount of volume, and yet this single game alone was sufficient to overload the entire Ethereum. And back in December, Ethereum transaction fees were like $1 million USD per day, and they were 90% utilized. So this is how bad it gets. Right? We have a long way to go before we can make blockchains the new internet. So I believe that the scalability problem is one of the biggest and most exciting challenges that we face today. So in our company, we believe that we have the best technology to overcome this challenge. And even with the single shard, we can achieve 100x more throughput than today's blockchains, and we can confirm transactions in less than a second. Okay, so today, I'm going to tell you about the core consensus protocol that will enable such a fast cryptocurrency. The protocol is called Thunderella. This is joint work with my colleague, Rafael Paz. And of course, it takes more than just the consensus protocol to build a cryptocurrency. Right? We have to have the right incentives. We have to have the right governance structure. But in the interest of time, today, I'm only going to focus on the consensus protocol. OK. So to understand consensus, I have to first explain to you what problem we are trying to solve. Right? So we want to build a public ledger. But here, instead, let's consider a classical scenario. We have a set of Google Wallet servers. And these servers, they want to agree on a linearly ordered log of transactions. And often, this is referred to as linearly ordered log or consensus. And in the rest of the talk, all of these terms pretty much mean the same thing. Okay, there are two important security properties that we care about, namely consistency and liveness. Consistency says that all of the honest nodes should agree on what this linearly ordered log is. And of course, the network has delay, right? So maybe your log will progress a little faster than mine. And that's OK, but nonetheless, at the end of the day, we have to all agree. OK, now the second property is liveness. Liveness says that whenever an honest client submits a transaction into the system, very soon, this transaction should appear in all of the honest nodes' logs. Well, it's not like we want to wait forever for our coffee. OK, so at first sight, this seems like a very boring problem. What's so exciting about building a linearly ordered log? Indeed, if all these nodes were honest and they correctly follow the protocol, then the problem indeed would have been trivial. But what is very non-trivial about it is when some of these nodes can be compromised. Like, for instance, they have malware, and these compromised or corrupt nodes, they can deviate arbitrarily from the correct protocol, for instance, to diverge the opinions of the honest nodes. And we want that even when this is the case, we want that the remaining set of honest nodes should nonetheless satisfy these security properties. And that's why this problem is very non-trivial. Okay. Well, as it turns out, state machine replication is not a new problem. Right? It has been around for 30 years. And the distributed systems community have been working on it for 30 years. In fact, in Silicon Valley, almost every company employs a state machine replication protocol to replicate their computing infrastructure. So for instance, Apache Zookeeper is an open source implementation of Paxos, which is a crash fault tolerant state machine replication protocol. And many of these companies basically use Apache Zookeeper. So traditionally, when we talk about consensus, the kind of scenario we have in mind is exactly what I talked about. There's a single organization like Google or Facebook. There are about a dozen nodes, and these nodes are connected using fast local area network. Okay, so this is kind of like tiny scale. And as I said, consensus itself isn't new, but what is new here is the large scale, right? With cryptocurrencies, we are looking at thousands to millions of nodes over the internet. And as it turns out, consensus on a large scale is a much, much more challenging problem. And this explains why all these companies and ICOs out there, everyone's creating, inventing, and implementing their own consensus protocol. But at the end of the day, when you think about it, this doesn't make much sense because, as we all know, consensus is just as tricky as crypto. And we learned in our undergrad security class that you shouldn't be rolling your own crypto implementation. So why is it the case that everyone's rolling their own consensus implementation? Okay. Therefore, in the rest of the talk, I'm going to try to answer these two questions. The first question, like I said, why, despite 30 years of work in the space, there still isn't a dream large-scale consensus protocol? And then, secondly, I would like to describe what I believe to be the dream large-scale consensus protocol. So let's begin with question number one. To understand why there still isn't a dream protocol, it helps to look at the consensus landscape. Roughly speaking, there are two broad classes of approaches, which I will call classical and blockchains. Okay, so classical protocols are represented by Paxos and PBFT and many other variants. And these are the protocols that companies like Google and Facebook implement. What do we know about classical consensus? When the network has abundant bandwidth, these protocols are fast because normally they can confirm transactions in constant number of round trips. But these protocols, on the other hand, are known to be incredibly complex, and this makes it difficult to implement them, to do security audit, and to do operational maintenance. And also, classical protocols, as we know, they don't scale very well to a large number of nodes. Okay, so now the modern, more attractive approach, of course, is blockchains. And the first protocol, the first blockchain-style protocol, of course, is Nakamoto consensus. And that is the consensus protocol behind Bitcoin. Okay, so what's interesting here is that we all know blockchains are a great empirical development, but in fact, there are mathematical breakthroughs as well. Right, so blockchain protocols, now we understand the mathematics behind blockchains. We know that the mathematics behind blockchains actually departs significantly from classical style consensus. Okay, but that's not the topic of this talk. What I wanted to say is that, okay, blockchains have one big advantage in that they're really simple, right? The protocol rules are, everyone looks for the longest chain, and we try to extend the longest chain by mining the next block. So it's very easy to implement. These protocols are very robust. In fact, they have been running robustly for the past 10, 11 years. But there's one main drawback. They're very slow, right? Bitcoin, every block takes 10 minutes to mine. If you want enough confidence, you have to wait for not just one block, you have to wait for 6 blocks, and that's easily an hour, right? So do I have to wait for an hour for my coffee? And another drawback that's often talked about is that these protocols are extremely wasteful. They consume energy because of proof of work. For the purpose of this talk, I want you to take a leap of faith and assume that this proof of work problem has already been overcome. We know how to solve the energy waste problem by replacing proof of work with other assumptions like proof of stake. And for instance, in our earlier work, we show how to remove proof of work, replace it with proof of stake, and yet be able to emulate the mathematics behind Nakamoto's consensus. Okay. Therefore, in the rest of the talk, whenever I mention blockchains, I mean both proof of work and non-proof of work approaches, like proof of stake. So even though we can make a proof of stake, these protocols nonetheless are very slow. Okay. And that's why neither approach is really ideal. So this brings us to the question, what is the dream protocol for large scale? Okay. So that's the question I will try to address. And the plan is the following. I will start by describing how classical consensus works. And in the middle, I'm going to get stuck. When I get stuck, I'm going to try to combine the best of both worlds to get the dream protocol. So let's get started. Are you ready? Okay. So here's the scenario we are working with today. We have Vitalik, who is the leader, and then we have a committee of voters. In a real-world cryptocurrency, these voters are chosen, for instance, by stake distribution. But here, these voters are superheroes. Now, some of these voters can be corrupt. Like in this case, Loki is corrupt. And of course, the leader can also be corrupt. So what I want to do right now is I will describe to you a very simple protocol. And I want us to think together what this protocol can achieve and what it cannot achieve. And here's how the protocol works. Okay, so very simple. Step number 1, the leader, Vitalik, is going to make a proposal, and the proposal contains a sequence number and a batch of transactions. So in practice, you always want to confirm a batch at a time, but for simplicity, I'm also going to call this a transaction in the talk. Okay, so now, what does the sequence number do? Remember, we are trying to make a linearly ordered log, and the sequence number is going to determine where in the log this transaction will land. Okay, so in the whole state machine replication protocol, there needs to be many instances of this little voting protocol, but for the time being, I'm going to focus on one little instance for a single sequence number. Okay, so step number 1, leader makes proposal. Step number 2, everyone's going to vote. Okay, so now, remember Vitalik proposed the golden transaction. And if you are honest, you are going to vote based on the leader's proposal. So in which case you vote for, you cast a golden vote. So a vote is basically a signature on the proposal you hear from the leader. And remember that Loki is corrupt. So he didn't vote on the golden transaction. Instead, he voted on the blue transaction and the red transaction. Okay, so now what do we do? Step number 3, we are going to wait. We wait until we hear enough votes on the same transaction. And at this moment, we believe, because enough people vouch for it, we believe that it is safe to output this transaction, to confirm this transaction. Okay, so that's the very simple one-round voting protocol. And the most important invariant to remember is that honest nodes are going to vote uniquely. So if I'm honest, I'm going to wait until the leader proposes something to me, and I will vote on this proposal and only this proposal. Okay? And with this in mind, I will show you how to prove consistency, and the proof is also incredibly simple. And before that, let me describe the parameters we assume. We will assume that there are n voters, and among them, at most 1/3 can be corrupt. Actually, less than 1/3 can be corrupt. So in this case, I claim that I only have to wait for 2/3 of the votes, and then it would be safe to output. Okay, so why does this protocol give consistency? And here's a very simple argument. Imagine, in this case, Spider-Man has seen 2/3 of the people voting for the red transaction, and Iron Man has seen 2/3 people voting for the orange transaction. So now if you do the math, the intersection of the red set and the orange set must contain at least one honest node, because the number of corrupt nodes is less than 1/3. So that's actually by a very simple pigeonhole principle. And remember what I said about honest nodes, right? They vote uniquely. And therefore, This guy in the intersection can only vote on one thing, and this means the red transaction must be equal to the orange. So very simple consistency proof. And an interesting thing to notice is that this consistency proof doesn't rely on the leader being honest. Like the only thing we are relying on here is that honest nodes vote uniquely. Okay, so with this in mind, let's look at the bigger picture. Right? So what does this protocol give us? There are two worlds, the world in which Vitalik is honest and the world in which Vitalik is corrupt. When Vitalik is honest, life's all good. We have both consistency and liveness. Consistency I've just proved to you. And why do we have liveness in this case? So when Vitalik is honest, he's going to propose the same transaction to everyone. And now all the honest nodes are going to vote on Vitalik's proposal. And because there are 2/3 of them, very soon you'll collect enough votes and you'll make progress. You'll confirm and make progress. Okay. And what about the case when Vitalik is corrupt? In this case, fortunately, we still have consistency, because as I said, the consistency proof never relied on leader being honest. But what breaks here is liveness. And why? Right? Because if Vitalik is corrupt, I mean, the simplest thing he can do is he can just crash and not make any proposals, and no one will make any progress in this case. He can also propose different things to different people, in which case everyone will just end up voting for a different thing, and no transaction will gain enough votes. Okay, so we get stuck in either case. Okay, so this looks quite nice, because it seems like the only problem we have to solve is the liveness issue. If we can solve the liveness issue, life's all good. And how do we achieve liveness? Well, it turns out in all these classical style protocols, this is done using a very complicated recovery mechanism, and I don't want to have to describe these approaches. And so there are many variants of these classical style consensus protocols, but they kind of all follow the same structure, right? There's a very simple normal path, which consists of one or more rounds of voting, basically the voting protocol I described. But when this normal path fails, the protocol falls back to a very complicated recovery path. And the interesting thing here is that during operations, we actually want the system to operate in the green part. We almost never want it to fall back to the red part. But when you look at the code, most of the code is actually in the red part, and that's where all the complexity and bugs are. So this isn't very desirable. And in fact, this recovery path is so complex. For instance, Chain.com is a company in San Francisco, and they're rolling blockchain solutions for Visa. So they basically completely gave up on implementing the recovery path. So they basically, they say we are only going to implement this normal path, and when things go wrong, we are just going to go to all these 100 banks that deploy the protocol and try to sync their logs, and then restart the protocol. And this is going to be a huge pain in practice. Okay, so it seems like we are kind of stuck at this point. But as I promised, now it's the time to try to combine the best of both worlds. And our idea is extremely simple. Okay, let's remove this messy, complicated red part, and we replace it with a very simple blockchain. So this is the high-level idea behind Thunderella. And nonetheless, it's still non-trivial to instantiate the idea correctly. I will tell you how to do this. And the terminology I would like to use is the fast path and the slow chain. Right? So the slow chain, you can think of it as Ethereum or Bitcoin, but it can also be a proof-of-stake slow chain. OK. And before I describe the protocol, here are the goals we would like to achieve. In normal operation, we want the system to be in the fast path. We also call it the optimistic path. And in the fast path, transactions should confirm in 2 to 3 actual network rounds. And we almost never have to write messages to the slow chain in the fast path. OK. And when things are not so good, it's not the end of the world, because we always have the slow chain to fall back to. So even in the worst case, we get the security and performance of today's blockchains. OK. So to understand our protocol, here's the scenario I'm going to work with. Let me just quickly help you recall. There's a leader, there's a committee, and we have an underlying slow chain. I mean, of course, the slow chain has its own miners. I'm going to assume that the leader and committee have already been elected. In practice, the leader and the committee, like you can elect using stake distribution, and the leader and the committee can rotate over time. But at the moment, I'm going to assume, consider a single snapshot. Okay. And the underlying blockchain, like as I said, you can think of it as Ethereum, but it can also be a proof of stake slow chain. To get the worst case robustness and security properties, we are going to make some assumptions. In particular, we will assume that the underlying slow chain is secure. And this typically involves assuming honest majority. If this is proof of work, it means honest majority in compute power. Otherwise, if it's proof of stake, it means honest majority in stake. We are also going to assume that the committee is majority honest as well. Okay. So now, how does the protocol work? The fast path is kind of like what I already told you. I'm going to very quickly revisit it. But here, I want to highlight what happens when there are multiple of these sequence numbers. Okay, so recall that leader makes a proposal, and the committee will vote. And when the transaction collects enough votes, in particular, in this case, if it picks up 3/4 votes from the committee, I'm going to call the transaction notarized. So here I changed the threshold. Like earlier, it was 2/3, but now it's 3/4 because now we want to tolerate minority corruption. And earlier, we were working with like 1/3. Okay. So now there are multiple of these sequence numbers. And in this case, sequence number 1, 2, 3 have been notarized. 4 is missing the notarization. And 5 and 6 have been notarized too. In a cryptocurrency system, it is important that you process these transactions in a linear order. Because maybe transactions 4 and 5 are trying to spend the same coin. And unless you process transaction 4, you wouldn't be able to detect that. Okay. In this case, the only prefix we can process is the prefix up to 3. And for the lack of a better term, I'm going to call this the maximal lucky sequence. The maximal lucky sequence is what you can confirm and output. Okay. So how do we address the liveness issue? Right? That was the question we had from the very start. And obviously, so far, we haven't used the slow chain at all. And the answer, of course, lies in the slow chain. And we are going to use the slow chain in 2 ways. First, we want to collect evidence when the fast path fails. Okay. And once we have collected evidence of fast path failing, we want to fall back to the slow chain and continue to post transactions to the slow chain to confirm. So this is called the slow mode. I mean, of course, once we are in the slow mode, we don't want to be there forever, but we can always try to bootstrap the fast path from the slow mode. Okay, I will tell you, number 1, how to do this detection, and number 2, how to enter the slow mode in a secure manner. So, okay, how do we do the detection? And the challenge here is that we need a robust mechanism, a mechanism in which faulty nodes cannot falsely implicate an honest leader. If they can, then this can lead to denial of service attacks, and that's going to be bad. Okay, so here's a very simple idea. Suppose during normal operation, the committee are going to periodically post what's called heartbeats to the slow chain. So what is a heartbeat? A heartbeat contains a hash of the current fast path lock, and it has been notarized by the committee. Okay, so normally, when things are all good, every now and then there's a new heartbeat. And I want to stress that during normal operations, we don't have to confirm all the transactions in the slow chain again. Everything just gets confirmed on the fast path. And the only thing that get posted to the slow chain are these tiny heartbeats. So that's how we get high throughput. Okay. Now, imagine at some point, I noticed that k blocks have gone by without a heartbeat. So this doesn't look good, right? Because something has gone wrong. And k here is the security parameter. For Ethereum, you can think of k as 300. Okay. So what do I do in this case? I conclude, why is this heartbeat missing? Maybe the leader has crashed. Or maybe the leader is malicious and trying to censor some transactions, and the committee want to rat the leader out by just stopping to vote. And in either case, the fast path will break, and we will have noticed it on the slow chain. OK, so now we detect the fast path has failed. How do we fall back to the slow chain? That's the second question we want to answer. It turns out, this may seem very simple in the beginning, but it turns out it's actually somewhat subtle. The problem here is that we have to reach agreement on the fast path log first before we can fall back to the slow chain, right? Because the network has delay. Maybe when I decide to fall back, let's say I'm Spider-Man, right? When I decide to fall back, my fast path log ends at 3. But when Iron Man decides to fall back, his network is a little faster, so his fast path log ends at 6. OK, how do we reach this agreement? It turns out, if you think about it a little more, this is an agreement problem in itself. Like earlier, we had always been punting on liveness, but here we cannot punt on liveness anymore. We have to solve this agreement problem in full. But fortunately, again, we have the slow chain to our help, right? You can think of the slow chain as it's a slow consensus mechanism, but it's sure and steady, and it's always there, right? The nodes can use the slow chain to communicate even when the fast path fails. OK, so it's kind of like a public bulletin board, but it's decentralized, the slow chain. OK, so how do we do this fallback? We are going to introduce a notion called grace period. And these k green blocks are the grace period. And again, k here is the security parameter. Like for Ethereum, you can think of it as 300. And we are going to use the grace period to reach agreement on the fast path log. OK, and here's what we do. I decide I want to fall back. The first thing I do is I stop participating on the fast path. I stop signing. And I'm going to tell everyone else all the notarized transactions I've seen. And I also want to post all the notarized but uncheckpointed transactions to the slow chain. Right? So remember earlier, we have heartbeats, and the heartbeats actually serve as a checkpointing mechanism. Every transaction that has been kind of whose hash has kind of been included in the checkpoint is considered already checkpointed. But otherwise, I'm going to post this notarized transaction to the slow chain. So by the end of the grace period, we will have reached agreement on the fast path log. And there is another subtlety here, because so if at the beginning of the grace period, I have already confirmed some transaction, I don't want it to be lost by the end of the grace period. So the property I want to prove is that by the end of the grace period, the maximal lucky sequence contained in the slow chain must be at least as long as where everyone started with. So this makes sure confirmed transactions are not going to be rolled back by the end of the grace period. So we have a formal proof of this in our paper, and I won't go into the details here. OK, so to quickly summarize, we use the blockchain, in particular a heart beating mechanism, to detect fast path failure. And then we rely on the grace period to do the fallback securely. And once we are in the slow mode, of course, we always want to try to rebootstrap the fast path whenever possible. OK. Let me quickly recap the security properties, right? So when things are majority honest, we get the worst case guarantees. And what is important here is that we don't have to trust the leader. What can a malicious leader do? Even when Vitalik is arbitrarily malicious, the only thing it can do is to slow down the protocol. It cannot break consistency, nor can it stop the system. So you can actually think of the leader as an accelerator. Right, so its job is to accelerate blockchains. A very imprecise analogy is, Akamai accelerates the internet. If Akamai is there, internet is faster. But if Akamai isn't there, the internet is still there. It's just like slower. So we are kind of like the Akamai of blockchains. OK. So that's also, this is important because that's also why the system is fundamentally decentralized. But we can, get kind of the best of both worlds. We can get the performance of centralized systems with this accelerator. OK. So now, when can we benefit from this instant confirmation? When things are good. Let's say if the leader is honest and online, and if the committee is like 3/4 honest and online, then everything will confirm on the fast path, and we almost never have to use the slow chain in this case. And I haven't talked about all the incentive mechanisms we have. Like in practice, you want to design the reward and incentive mechanisms right. So these people are actually incentivized to behave honestly. Okay. So that's kind of our protocol. To quickly summarize, you can just remember these 2 sentences, and then you can reconstruct the protocol yourself when things are good. There's a single round of voting, and confirmation happens very fast in the fast path. And when things go back, we use the slow chain to do fallback. And then in the slow mode, you should always try to rebootstrap the fast path. So that's the Thunderella paradigm. I have omitted a lot of other details, like how to do committee and leader election. We have practical optimizations that I haven't talked about. And we have also formal mathematical proofs of correctness. OK. Now, before I conclude, I want to talk about some of the higher level insights we gained in this process. So why, after 30 years of work, we can claim to be much simpler and a lot faster than everyone else, right? So in fact, we have a new theoretical paradigm. And let me explain this. So all these classical protocols, like PBFT and Paxos, they work in what is called the asynchronous model. So a protocol is asynchronous if it is unaware of how long it takes to deliver messages. In other words, the same protocol has to work no matter how long the network delay is. It's kind of like a universal protocol. So this makes it much more challenging to design these protocols. But we kind of baited and switched, and we are using a blockchain protocol underneath. And the blockchain protocol, in some sense, is synchronous, because we have to parameterize the block interval. And we know that the blocked interval has to be sufficiently large with respect to the network delay to guarantee consistency for these protocols. OK. So synchronous protocols, can be much simpler to design. But interestingly, like in this classical body of distributed systems literature, synchronous protocols are kind of completely overlooked, because people kind of believe that synchrony is slow, right? In Google, Facebook scenario, we want microsecond to millisecond latency, and we just cannot afford to even wait for a single block interval or a synchronization delay, because this parameter has to be set very conservatively. If this assumption is violated, all bets are off. We can lose consistency. And our insight is that maybe this classical wisdom isn't exactly right. And if you look at Thunderella, it sits in this very nice corner, right? Because almost all the time, we actually operate in asynchronous land. Our fast path is asynchronous. But fundamentally, we are a synchronous protocol, because we fall back to a synchronous path. So that's why we can get the fast and the simplicity at the same time. OK. So here's an interesting point, putting on my theory hat. And there is a very well-known lower bound that shows if you want an asynchronous protocol, you can tolerate only 1/3 corruption. And so the classical wisdom is kind of like, if you want fast, you can only tolerate 1/3 corruption. But we showed that you can actually tolerate a half and still be fast almost all the time. OK, so this is also why we have a new theoretical paradigm. And the thing I like best about Thunderella is that it's extremely simple. And this is going to matter a lot in the large-scale deployment. OK, and finally, I wanted to mention that we are hiring. We have all sorts of positions open. Our office is in Sunnyvale. And again, you should try to mingle with our extremely strong team members in the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. And now we have time for about 3 questions. And I'll start over here.
So hi, I'm assuming that you need to use the slow chain to elect the committee members, so to have a committee to start with. So how would that election process be done? That's my assumption. I don't know if there's actually going to be an election. So.
Right. So there are many potential mechanisms, and currently, very imprecisely speaking, we want more stake to participate in the voting process. So then your fast path will be more secure. So very, very roughly speaking, we prefer people who have put down more stake. But the actual protocol we implement actually has subtleties, and so that we can make sure the equilibrium behavior is what we want. The equilibrium behavior should have certain nice properties. OK, all right. Huh? Sorry, I cannot hear you.
I was wondering if it was stake-based?
Right, so right now the fast path is selected based on stake. And in our V1, we are using Ethereum as the slow chain. But in V2, we plan to replace it with our own proof of stake slow chain. So in the end, like the whole system will be stake-based.
Right, thank you.
Thank you.
And I have a question right over here, and then I'll go to you.
So I'm wondering what confidence you have that you don't end up spending all the time living in the slow chain. What does an attack scenario look like? Maybe comparing it to something like a 51% attack, but what does it mean for more than half of your committee members, I guess it is, to be corrupt, or whatever it takes to put you into the slow chain state and keep you there?
So the question is about incentive and like, can you repeat the question?
But in the simplest way, why wouldn't you end up in a situation where you're always using the slow chain?
Why is there a scenario that we always want to use the slow chain? Why? Sorry, I cannot hear you very well in the back.
I think I can explain.
Okay.
I think he was trying to say that if 51% are corrupt, is there a scenario in which the mechanism would always be in the slow chain?
And when you are in the slow mode, you should always try to rebootstrap. So this, like, you can design different policies, right? Like in the most general way, you can think of like running a smart contract in the slow chain to elect new leader and committee. But maybe, you know, the simplest thing you should try, like maybe if let's say the accelerator, the leader has crashed, then the leader can post a message to the slow chain to say, okay, now I'm ready again, and everyone rejoin. So then you can try to always rebootstrap the fast path. Like the committee members are incentivized to go back to the fast path because they're earning rewards and transaction fees if the fast path is confirming transactions really fast.
Great. And one final question right here in the front.
Great presentation. I really like all the pictures. It shows the idea and really well. So my question is, you didn't really go into it. How do you go from, once you're in the slow path, how do you bootstrap and go back into the fast path again? I don't think you really went into detail on that, or really explained it.
So I think maybe the question is of a similar nature. Like when you are in the slow chain, how do you go back to the fast path? Yeah. Like the simplest thing you can do is, let's say the fallback is due to accelerator crash, right? And then the accelerator can, you know, fix itself and post a message to the slow chain to announce, okay, now I'm ready again, and everyone rejoin at this slow chain height. But, you know, you can also have like a more complex policy, like you can use a smart contract on the slow chain to re-elect the committee, and you can create some competition between like different accelerator and different committee members to create like an ecosystem. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you.